Instructor said, "Lift what you can." Deathworld girl asked, "You mean their max or mine?" The hall smelled of ozone, and something Quellath species had no word for: the mineral residue of effort, the specific chemistry of pushed muscle, a scent the Drevani associated with the best kind of work. He had been here 40 minutes already when the first candidate arrived. That was standard. Quellath arrived early. He ran the diagnostic on the floor array, each quadrant in sequence, gravity confirmed at 0.78 of Earth normal, checked the mass block calibration, and opened the assessment console. 13 candidates today. He had written his summaries for all 13 before a single one had stepped through the door. In 41 cycles, filing early had never once been wrong. The hall ran clockwise by species assignment. Caerleon first, then the 3 Veth, 2 Murani, and so on down through the morning schedule, each candidate arriving at a known ceiling, each departure recorded without surprise. The silhouette archive on the far wall backlit each record holder in pale green. Quellath rarely looked at it anymore. The names it contained were already in his summary files. The session moved with the rhythm of a machine running well. The Caerleon in the 11th position exceeded her projection by 9 kilos, something Quellath noted with mild interest, the way a craftsman notes a grain that ran slightly right. The Murani who followed her came in 12 kilos below. The deviation averaged out, as it always did. His secondary nervous cluster ran cool and colorless along the ridges of his forearms through all of it. In the 14th position, a human female. Quellath had filed her summary before breakfast, projected ceiling 310 kilograms. He considered this generous. The reference literature supported 280 as the median for her recorded body weight, but Quellath was not unkind. He had assessed 11 humans in his career. Their ceilings were known quantities. He had written them cleanly without drama, and the numbers had held. He did not glance at the door when the entry scanner logged her arrival. He was calibrating the load sequence for the next block. She was smaller than the scan had suggested. Not shorter, compact was the more accurate word, the kind of build that implied the frame was doing more than its proportions advertised. She wore the standard issue assessment uniform over what looked like an older undershirt, the collar of it visible at the neck, faded from a color that might once have been green. Over her left shoulder, a canvas field bag well used. In her left hand, a dented olive drab canteen, the kind of thing issued in quantity to Expeditionary Corps and returned in smaller numbers. The dent on its side was old. The serial stamp on the base was from a mountain rescue organization Quellath had no record of. He noticed the canteen the way he noticed deviations, as data. Her biometric ping came back to his console automatically. Suboptimal mass distribution for graviton load bearing. Exactly what he'd noted in the pre-filed summary. He gestured toward the platform without looking up. "Standard protocol," he said. "Lift what you can, we record your limit, no theatrics." There was a pause, not the hesitation of a nervous candidate, something more deliberate, something that took up space in the room without announcing itself. He looked up. She was looking at the mass block array with an expression he couldn't immediately place. Professional curiosity, maybe. The kind of attention someone gives to a tool they're about to use, not a challenge they're afraid of. She set the canteen on the floor beside the platform. Not on the equipment rack, not on the bench provided for personal items. Just on the floor, within easy reach, as if she planned to pick it up again in a minute, and this was a brief interruption. "Before I step up," she said, "when you say lift what I can, do you mean what I can lift or what you can record?" Quellath blinked. His secondary cluster stayed cool. He explained, with the patience he kept for candidates who were nervous rather than dim, that the test measured her biological maximum, that the instruments recorded whatever the candidate produced, and that the two things were therefore the same quantity. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Good, I just wanted to make sure." She stepped onto the platform. The canteen sat on the floor beside it. It would sit there through everything that followed, dented and unremarkable, while the mass blocks commanded the room. Queleth keyed his console. He was thorough by habit, and so instead of starting at the standard human opening load, 150 kilograms, the customary entry point, he decided to begin at the Drevani record, 680 kilograms. He would let her approach it from below and mark where she stopped, a useful data point. He had done this before with candidates who showed unusual baseline readings, and it always located the ceiling faster. "We'll start higher than standard to save time," he said. "The block is 680. Attempt when ready." "Sure," she said. He expected her to study the block the way most candidates did, circling it once, adjusting grip position several times, testing the surface texture, breathing in a particular practice pattern. He expected to watch her attempt the lift somewhere in the 380 to 400 range, at which point the lactic markers would spike, and she would set the block down with the particular expression of someone who has met a wall they did not know was coming. He was already composing the language for the revised summary. Candidate showed commendable effort. Limit established at. She gripped the block and lifted it. No bounce, no grunt, no visible tremor in the forearms. A full 2-second hold, then a controlled descent, careful, not relieved. The platform readout registered 683 kilograms actual. The block had been marginally heavier than its nominal rating. Queleth's secondary nervous cluster flushed amber for the first time in this session. He said nothing. He looked at the biometric wall, oxygen saturation 96%, cardiac rhythm elevated within training variance, lactic markers inside the band he associated with a brisk uphill walk. He tapped his console and escalated. She had not broken a sweat. That was the detail that would not settle. In 41 cycles, Queleth had watched species with twice her mass, species with bone structures engineered over millennia for exactly this kind of load, grunt and labor through the 600-kilogram range. He had watched decorated Drevani athletes require 20 seconds and 3 grip adjustments to hold 680. She had lifted it in one motion, held it like a question she already knew the answer to, and set it back down. He loaded 820 kilograms and watched the biometric wall as she lifted it. Oxygen saturation 96%, cardiac rhythm still training elevated, lactic markers unmoved. A low sound moved through the observation gallery above, not a gasp, something more like the noise a room makes when everyone in it adjusts their posture at the same time. Queleth did not look up. He was looking at the number he had filed before the session, 310 kilograms. It sat in the summary field in the calm administrative font he used for all his filings, next to the words projected ceiling, and the gap between that number and the platform readout had begun to feel less like a margin and more like a wall he had built in the wrong place. He pressed the intercom. "I need Drevak and phone on the floor," he said. "Assessment instruments may be returning anomalous readings. Immediate." It was not an emergency call. He used the neutral framing on purpose. He needed them to confirm the instruments, not to witness something he couldn't yet name. He set his console to the next load increment and waited for them to arrive. And while he waited, he stared at the biometric wall, and the wall continued to show readings that had no reason to exist. There were 4 minutes before the doors opened. She waited on the platform, hands loose at her sides, weight settled in her heels. She was not performing patience. She was simply waiting the way a structure waits, present, untroubled, available. The canteen sat on the floor below her. The number 310 sat in his summary file. Queleth had not revised a pre-filed summary in 41 cycles of practice. He did not revise it now. You won't want to look away from what happens next. Stay close. 3 days into her enrollment at Halcyon, according to her intake file, Mara Solis had requested a list of every load-bearing trial in the standard species assessment suite. The intake coordinator had sent it automatically, assuming she was anxious and wanted to prepare. She had replied with one follow-up question. Did any of the trials take place in subatmospheric conditions? The coordinator had answered. No, the Institute ran all load assessments at 0.78 gravity standard. There was no reply after that. The question had been logged and forgotten. Queleth had not seen the intake file until after the session was over. He had not thought to look at it before. This was the first thing he would note in the reclassification report 3 weeks later under the heading Prior Indicators. That the question was there, that it had been answered honestly, and that no one had understood what was being asked. Drevek arrived first, portable biometric scanner already active. Phone came in behind him. Both were senior assessors. Both had worked this hall for longer than most of the species on today's roster had been enrolled. They set up their parallel sweep in the time it took Queleth to load the next block, 940 kilograms, which had a placard on its side noting that Drevani candidates required supervised spotting above 900. Neither assessor said anything. They ran their sweep. Queleth watched the data come back on 2 screens simultaneously. His wall, their portable, and the numbers matched exactly. The instruments were not malfunctioning. She lifted 940 kilograms. At the apex of the lift, she paused and shifted to a one-hand grip, rotating the block slightly to test the angle. She had asked first, a quiet question, directed at Queleth. Is single-hand data useful to you? He had said yes before he finished deciding whether it was. She made the adjustment and held the block one-handed at full extension, then lowered it with the same care as every lift before. Drevak's portable scanner emitted a tone it had not produced in his possession. He checked the battery. The battery was full. Phone said something to Queleth in a register too low for the gallery to catch. Queleth did not answer. He was staring at the biometric wall, at a set of readings that kept refusing to be what they should have been. Oxygen saturation 97%, cardiac rhythm stable, lactic threshold not approached. One word kept forming in the back of his mind, and he kept refusing to let it finish, because the word, if he let it finish, would mean the summary he had filed was not a projection. It was a fiction. He escalated again. The load counter on his console read 940. He had never in 41 cycles of practice reached this number with a biological candidate still standing upright and showing no strain pattern. The load he escalated to now was 1,050 kilograms, the upper range of what Halcyon's assessment protocol listed as exoskeletal assist territory, a range reserved for Drevani candidates in their 3rd year of strength conditioning. She lifted it. The hold was 4 seconds this time. When she set it down, she moved her left foot slightly, redistributing weight, and rolled her left shoulder once, the same small habit she'd shown when she first stepped on the platform. It was not a pain response. Queleth had spent 41 cycles watching pain responses. This was the motion of someone adjusting to their own body's preferences, the way a craftsman shifts a grip not because the tool is slipping, but because a slightly different angle is simply better. He typed the escalation code for the next block and stopped. Something was wrong with the room. Not a mechanical fault, not an instrument alarm, something in the quality of the silence coming from the observation gallery above, a silence that had changed texture over the last 4 lifts, thinning from professional attentiveness into something more like collective held breath. He had stopped hearing small sounds, the consultative murmurs between gallery observers, the occasional datapad beep from the second-tier stations. They had all gone quiet without Queleth noticing when it happened. He looked up for the first time since Drevak and Phone had arrived. There were 11 observers in the gallery. He had logged for this morning. The rest had come in quietly at some point during the session, assessors from adjacent halls, 2 intake administrators he recognized, a methods instructor whose shift did not include sub-level 4. They were watching the biometric wall. None of them were watching their own screens. Queleth looked back at his console. He typed the next escalation. 1,140 kilograms. The block rose on its cradle with the mechanical precision Queleth required of all equipment in his haul. She walked to it, checked her grip angle, 2 seconds of deliberate palm contact to read the surface, and lifted. The cradle's hydraulic sensor registered full load transfer in 0.6 seconds, which was fast. The 4-second hold, the careful descent. On the biometric wall, oxygen saturation 97%, cardiac rhythm stable, lactic threshold not approached, strain pattern, the visual map that should by now be showing the architecture of a working body meeting its limits, remained blank. The analysis software was not generating an output. It had not generated one since the 940-kilogram lift. Drevek crossed the floor to Queleth's station without being summoned. He stood beside the console and looked at the biometric wall and then at Queleth, and neither of them said anything. In 22 cycles of joint work, Drevek had never crossed the floor unasked. He had sent notes, filed flags, spoken through the intercom from the observation level. He had never simply come to stand beside Queleth and look at the same problem without speaking. The word that had been forming in Queleth's mind since the first lift was still not finished. He was still refusing to let it finish. The word, if it finished, would mean the pre-filed summary was not a projection. Below the observation gallery, on the floor beside the platform, the canteen sat exactly where she had put it, dented side facing out. The serial stamp from the Mountain Rescue Corps still visible from where Queleth stood. He loaded 1,220 kilograms. This time she paused before approaching the block. Not hesitation, the same deliberate quality she had shown at the start when she asked her clarifying question. She tilted her head slightly, as if reading something in the block's dimensions that had changed. Grip geometry shifts above 1,200, she said. It was not a complaint. It was the neutral observation of a technician noting a variable. She adjusted her stance by approximately 3 centimeters and approached. Phone's hand moved to his scanner and stopped. He had been about to log a pre-lift notation, the standard practice for candidates approaching unusual load ranges. He did not log it. Queleth registered the gesture and understood it. Phone was no longer certain what a pre-lift notation would say. She lifted 1,220 kilograms. She held it for 5 seconds, the longest hold yet, and lowered it with the same care as every other, setting the block down as if the care mattered to her independent of whether anyone was watching, as if she would do it that way regardless. Queleth stared at the biometric wall. The wall stared back with the equanimity of equipment that was simply reporting what it found. He had filed a summary that said 310 kilograms, and the woman it described was standing on his platform at 1,220 kilograms with a resting cardiac rhythm and 97% oxygen saturation. And he had not revised his summary, and the gap between those two facts had grown so wide it had stopped feeling like a margin of error and started feeling like a record of a different person entirely. He pressed his secondary intercom. Hall gravity, he said, shift to Earth standard 1.0. Drevek looked at him. Queleth did not look back. He had not run a session at Earth standard in 6 years. The 0.78 baseline existed for a reason. It served as a neutral midpoint across the 18 enrolled species, none of whom evolved under Earth's particular atmospheric load. Shifting to 1 meant increasing the effective weight of every block by a factor his assessment protocols listed as compensatory for certain Drevani elite candidates only. The floor array recalibrated. The pressure shift was not violent, a dull drop, like a door closing in an adjacent room, but felt across the whole body. Several of the gallery observers shifted in their seats. The Caerleon intake administrator gripped her armrests with both hands and said nothing. Mara Soli straightened. Her posture, which had been good, became something more than good, the specific improvement in bearing that comes when a body stops compensating for a deficit it didn't know it was managing. She rolled her left shoulder once. The same habit. faster this time and with a looseness in the joint that had not been there before. "That's better," she said, to no one in particular. The room understood before Quellath did. He knew this because the silence changed again, a second change in texture, different from the first. The first silence had been the quiet of observers watching something they could not explain. This silence was the quiet of observers who had just explained it to themselves and were waiting to see whether the man running the assessment console had reached the same place. He had not. Not yet. He was still holding the two facts apart by force, the 0.78 g baseline they had been operating in, and the gravity of the world she came from, refusing to let them occupy the same thought, because once they did, the arithmetic followed automatically, and he was not yet ready for the arithmetic. She had been working in below-standard gravity since she walked in. Every load she had cleared, the 683 kilograms, the 820, the 940 and the rest, had been heavier for her than the floor array's numbers reflected. The blocks weighed what they weighed. The gravity they were lifted in changed how the body experienced that weight. At 0.78 g, a body that evolved under 1 g was not performing at neutral. It was performing under a continuous mild assist, the way a current helps a swimmer without the swimmer choosing it. She had not chosen it. She had simply walked into a hall set to a baseline she had never lived in. The numbers on the biometric wall were not anomalous. They were exactly what they should be for a body operating in conditions slightly easier than the ones it had trained in its entire life. Quellath let the two facts occupy the same thought. The arithmetic arrived. He opened his pre-filed summary. He looked at the number 310 in the projected ceiling field. He looked at the platform readout showing 1,220. He looked at the biometric wall showing a resting cardiac rhythm. Phone touched his arm. Quellath pulled his arm away without looking. He pressed the escalation key. 1,340 kilograms. She lifted it, she held it, she set it down. The observation gallery was completely silent. Even the air circulation hum from the upper vents seemed to have reduced itself out of some ambient sense of decorum. Drevek said quietly to no one in particular, "She hasn't reached it yet." He was not speculating. He was reading the biometric wall the same way Quellath was reading it, and the wall showed a body that had not, by any metric in the assessment suite's measurement vocabulary, approached the boundary of what it could do. The strain pattern field remained blank. The analysis software remained idle. The word the software had no output for was also the word that had been forming in Quellath's mind for the past 40 minutes, and now it finished. Undefined. He was running an assessment session with a candidate whose biological limit, by every instrument in the hall, had not been located. In 41 cycles, that had never been the result. He escalated twice more in the following hour, each increment larger than the last. She cleared both loads with the same flat professionalism, grip check, lift, hold lower with care. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Quellath. She looked at each block with the specific attention of someone assessing a task, determining the approach, doing the task. There was nothing in her expression that resembled effort in the way Quellath had spent 41 cycles learning to recognize effort. There was only work, and then the work completed, and then the waiting for the next one. At some point between the fourth and fifth escalations after the gravity shift, something changed in the observation gallery above. Not the silence was already complete. What changed was the configuration of faces. The 11 observers, at some moment Quellath could not precisely identify, had all turned away from the biometric wall and were now watching Quellath instead. They were watching him the way people watch someone who is still running an equation the room has already solved. He was not yet done running it. He typed the next escalation. Drevek stepped to the console. He placed his hand on the edge of the panel, not on any control, just on the edge. The The way you place your hand on the shoulder of someone who is about to do something they may not have thought all the way through. Queleth, he said. The blocks in the reserve subfloor, the architectural calibration series, there is one logged at the bottom of the rack. Queleth looked at him. I'm not suggesting it, Drevek said. I want to make certain you've thought about whether you're considering it. Queleth looked at the console. The architectural calibration block was not in the assessment protocol. It was not a biological candidate load. It had a posted warning on 3 faces in Drevani, in trade standard, in the Halcyon Safety Code, specifying that it was intended for structural stress testing of the hall itself, not for living bodies. The last time it had moved was during a renovation 6 years ago. The reason Drevak was asking the question was the same reason Queleth had already begun looking at the subfloor reserve controls. In 41 cycles, he had never not found a ceiling. He needed to know whether one existed. He had the sudden, clear, uncomfortable awareness that the summary he filed this morning, 310 kilograms, projected ceiling, was not going to be the last thing he wrote today. It might be the only thing he had ever written that he wished he could permanently delete. He looked at the platform. She was waiting in the same ready stance, weight in her heels, hands loose at her sides. The canteen sat on the floor beside her at the level of her left ankle. From where Queleth stood, it looked smaller than it had at the beginning of the session, which was impossible. It was the same object it had always been. The session clock above the hall entrance showed 3 hours and 17 minutes elapsed. The standard assessment protocol ran 40 minutes. He had been in this room for 3 hours and 17 minutes and had not found what he came in expecting to find in the first 5. I'm aware of the block, Queleth said to Drevek. I haven't decided. That was not entirely true. Some part of the decision had already been made. He could feel it the way you feel a door that has already been opened in the room behind you, not from seeing it, but from the change in the air. He decided overnight. That was not the truth. The truth was that the decision had already been made, the way a crack decides before the stone falls. But he told himself overnight because it gave the fact some distance from the moment he had felt the door open behind him while Drevak's hand rested on the console edge, and neither of them spoke. The architectural block was in the subfloor reserve rack. It had been there for 6 years. It would be there the next morning if he went home now, logged the session incomplete, and came back with clearer thinking and a properly revised summary filed through the standard channels. He did not go home. He said to the room in general, load the reserve block. Drevek removed his hand from the console edge. He moved to the secondary authorization panel on the far wall, the one that required a senior assessor's code for subfloor release, and he pressed his palm to the reader without looking at Queleth. Not reluctance, not excitement, the quiet of someone who has also needed to know. The floor groaned once beneath them, low and mechanical, as the hydraulic cradle in the sublevel began its ascent. In the gallery, someone left. Queleth heard the door, a soft pressure release, the specific sound of the observation level's secondary exit being used from the inside. He did not look up. He did not know who it was. The remaining 10 observers were motionless. The air circulation system had not changed in volume, but the room felt quieter than it had, the way rooms feel when everyone in them is holding a breath they agreed to hold at the same time without discussing it. The cradle delivered the block to the floor level through the platform's loading aperture, a mechanical sequence that took 4 minutes and produced a series of sounds Queleth had not heard in 6 years. The deep complaint of the hydraulic lines under unusual load, the grinding precision of the guide rails, the final settling impact that came up through the soles of his feet before he heard it. The block was matte gray. No stabilization glow, no activation coding, none of the visual markers that assessment blocks carried to help candidates gauge geometry. It was a calibration instrument that had never considered the needs of a biological candidate, because no one had ever loaded it for one. A warning label ran along its longest face in 3 languages. Queleth could read 2 of them, and both said the same thing: architectural stress calibration only, not for biological load assessment. He had authorized it anyway. The automated safety system asked for confirmation. He confirmed. It asked whether the authorization was in compliance with assessment protocol. He answered that it was not. It logged his override and went quiet. She looked at it the same way she had looked at everything else. Not the way you look at something dangerous. The way you look at a thing you are about to do because someone has asked you to do it and you have no particular objection. "Is this one for a specific purpose," she said, "or is it just the next one?" "It is the largest load in this hall," Queleth said. "Okay," she said. She did not rush. This was the detail that Queleth would write first in the reclassification report, above all the numbers and the instrument readings and the floor damage assessment. She did not rush. She approached the block with the same grip check routine she had used for every lift since the first one: palm contact, 2 seconds, reading the surface the way you read a sentence before you say it aloud. She adjusted her stance. She set her feet. The gallery had gone past silence into something with its own texture, a stillness that had weight, that pressed down. Queleth realized he was not breathing normally. He did not correct this. She gripped the block and began to lift. The platform did not crack immediately. There was a delay, a fraction of a second in which the floor array's load distribution sensors ran their calculations, compared the incoming data to their tolerance limits, and began generating a warning output that the system had never generated before for a biological session. The warning was still compiling when the full load transferred from the hydraulic cradle to her body. The instant the weight was entirely hers. Then the platform cracked. The sound was not what Queleth had expected. Not a bang, not a collapse, a single precise line, moving diagonally beneath her heels with the purposeful geometry of a decision, and a tone that was somehow exact, like a note played on something very large and very old. The load distribution sensor tore from its floor anchor and the cable end swung free. The structural alarm triggered overhead, 3 pulses, the evacuation tone, the one that brought engineering teams from the upper levels. She held the block upright, steady, not trembling, not adjusting, the particular stillness of a wall holding. Queleth found the safety stop and hit it. "Set it down," he said. She lowered the block with the same care she had used every time, the specific, deliberate care of someone for whom setting a thing down gently is not a performance but a habit, the way you close a door softly in a house where someone is sleeping. She stepped backward off the cracked platform. She was not winded. Her hands were loose at her sides. She did not look at the crack in the floor. The biometric wall read, oxygen saturation 97%, cardiac rhythm stable, lactic threshold not breached, muscle integrity intact. In the lower right quadrant of the wall, where the strain pattern analysis had been running idle since the 940-kilogram lift, a single output now displayed. Not a strain pattern. The software had generated one word in the output field, the category label it assigned when no existing category fit the incoming data: pending classification. One scanning drone attempted to generate a load analysis and crashed its logic stack. Another drone blinked a red error, no strain pattern available. A third powered down its analysis module and waited. Queleth opened his console. The pre-filed summary was still there. He had not closed it, had not modified it, had not sent it to archive. It sat in the calm administrative font he used for every filing, and the projected ceiling field read 310 kilograms, and below that, human female, suboptimal load frame. He had written those words this morning. He had written them before she walked in. He had written them in the time it took to eat breakfast and run a floor diagnostic, because 11 humans and 41 cycles had given him everything he thought he needed to know about what a human woman would do when she stepped onto a graviton platform. He read the words. He closed the file without saving. The session clock above the hall entrance read 4 hours and 2 minutes. The engineering team arrived from the upper catwalks in the time it took Queleth to cross the floor to the platform edge and look at the crack. 3 technicians, 2 in structural assessment gear, 1 carrying a floor-array diagnostic kit. They stopped when they saw the block. The senior technician looked at Queleth, then at the block, then at the crack, then at Mara. She was standing to the side, hands loose, waiting in the same patient way she had waited through everything today. "The floor," Queleth said, "not the candidate." The senior technician nodded slowly, which was the nod of someone taking careful note of a sentence they will think about later. Queleth turned away from the crack and looked at her. He had one question. It had arrived in him sometime in the last 4 hours. He could not have said exactly when, and it was not a question he had ever asked a candidate before. The assessment protocol provided no field for it. There was no line in the summary form where it would fit. He poured a half cup of water from the carafe at the table's edge, the room's working carafe, standard equipment, slightly warm from the hours it had been sitting. He did not drink it. He set it back down. The motion was purely habitual, the small automatic act of a person who needed a beat of time before saying something that mattered. He faced her. "What is the heaviest thing you have ever carried?" She did not think about it. The answer was not something she had to locate. It was there already, the way things are there when they have been carried long enough. "A colleague," she said, 3 kilometers uphill. There was debris fall. This was in Patagonia, a mountain extraction, search and rescue. His radio was out, the evacuation point was above us, and he couldn't walk." Queleth waited. "It was heavier than this," she said, "not because this block was lighter." The way she said it made the distinction clear. This block, if she had set it down, would have stayed where it fell. It would not have been changed by being set down. "Because this was never going to die if I put it down." The observation gallery above them was completely silent. Drevak, standing 3 meters to Queleth's left, had not moved in several minutes. His portable scanner was dark. He had stopped collecting data at some point during the architectural block lift and had not restarted it. The canteen sat on the floor at the platform's edge, at the level of Mara's left ankle, dented side out. The crack in the floor ran 6 centimeters to its left. The canteen was undamaged. It was, Queleth observed without quite meaning to, the only object in the immediate area that had not been stressed, overloaded, or forced to revise its assessment of the situation. He was going to include it in the report. He did not know yet why, but he was going to include it. She was holding back. Drevak said it quietly, not to Queleth, not to the gallery, not, apparently, to anyone. He said it the way a person states something they have just proven to themselves, the way you say the answer to an arithmetic problem aloud before you write it down. The senior engineering technician looked up from the floor crack. Drevak said it again, not louder, just with more certainty. She was holding back through all of it. Queleth knew it was true. He had known it since the biometric wall showed him a resting cardiac rhythm at a load that should have been the outer edge of any biology's tolerance. A body at its limit looks a specific way. The instruments know it. The assessor reading them knows it. And 41 cycles of practice made knowing it automatic. What the wall had been showing him for 4 hours was not a body at its limit. It was a body operating inside its range. A body in a hall set to conditions it found mild, lifting loads the hall considered extreme, and never once reaching the place where the next step up would have mattered. She had not been performing. She had been responding to the question as it was actually asked, lift what you can, and what she could do had simply not fit inside the question. The new sensor array in the corner of the hall, which Queleth had installed 2 years ago for expanded biometric capture, had been running a silent baseline comparison since the session began. It had found no comparison point in its database. It had been saving her data in an unlinked file, waiting for a category. It was still waiting. Before Queleth could write anything, before the reclassification language had arrived in his mind in the particular shape it needed to take, a second alert came from the console, the session's automated summary prompt. The assessment software, which ran on a 40-minute cycle calibrated to the standard session length, had now generated 5 autoprompts asking Queleth to finalize his pre-filed summary. He had dismissed all 5. The 6th prompt asked whether the session was complete. He looked at the platform, the cracked floor, the block settled in its place, the engineering team's diagnostic lines running across the tile. He looked at the biometric wall, at the oxygen saturation figure still displaying from her last lift, and at the strain pattern field still reading pending classification. He looked at the summary field on his console with its 310-kilogram figure. He had not saved the close. He had not filed the incomplete. He had not done anything administrative in 4 hours and 2 minutes except escalate load increments and countermand a safety override. He dismissed the 6th prompt. Mara, he said. It was the first time he had used her name in the session. She looked at him. The session, he said. It is not complete. I need you to remain available. There are entries I have not yet written, and I cannot write them until I understand what category they belong to. She picked up her canteen from the floor beside the platform. She checked the dent on its side the way you check a familiar thing you have been away from, not to assess damage, just to confirm it is still itself. I'm not going anywhere, she said. The dent was still there. The canteen was still what it had always been. The session clock above the door read 4 hours and 4 minutes, and outside the hall the Halcyon Institute was proceeding with the ordinary business of its afternoon, as if Sublevel 4 were not in the process of running out of categories. He did not write the entry that night. He sat at the assessment console for 40 minutes after the engineering team cleared the floor, after Drevak and Phone filed their witness records and went upstairs, after Mara Solis left with her canteen and her field bag and nothing else. He sat with the blank summary field open on his screen and wrote nothing, because the category he needed had not yet arrived in a form he could put into administrative language. He went home, he made tea. He sat with the tea until it was cold. In the morning he wrote the entry in one session, without revising, because by then the language had arrived on its own, and revision would only have made it smaller. Homo sapiens female, biological limit not located, testing terminated due to equipment failure, no projected ceiling on file, assessment protocol, standard no deviation noted by the candidate. He paused. He looked at the wall above his desk, where he kept nothing, blank plaster, a habit from early in his career when he had been told that an examiner who decorates their workspace is an examiner who has started performing certainty rather than practicing it. He wrote 3 more lines. Session duration exceeded standard by a factor of 6. Equipment failure, floor array, load platform, 1 drone logic stack. No biological candidate injury. The only object brought by the candidate, retrieved undamaged. 1 field canteen, origin Earth, age and manufacturer unknown. He looked at that last line for a long time. It had no place in a load assessment report. There was no field for personal effects. There was no precedent for noting what a candidate brought and left with. Drevak would ask about it. The records administrator would flag it. He submitted the entry without removing it. The note to his senior staff was 3 sentences. He wrote it the same morning, distributed it before the building opened for the day's sessions, and did not sign it with his title, just his name, the way you sign something you are saying as a person rather than a function. She was not performing. She was responding to the question as it was actually asked. We asked the wrong question for 41 cycles. He did not name her. He did not need to. Phone received the note and read it twice. He sent back one word, yes. Drevek did not reply. 3 days later, Queleth found that Drevek had begun rewriting the intake assessment form for human candidates, not the load chart itself, which Queleth had already removed from the protocols, but the initial biometric intake section, the one that asked for mass distribution and projected load frame. Drevek had replaced it with a single open question. Describe, in your own words, the most physically demanding situation you have encountered. Include terrain, duration, and whether others were present. Queleth read this. He thought about a 3-kilometer uphill extraction in Debris Fall, a colleague who could not walk, a radio that wasn't working, and an evacuation point above. He approved the change without comment. The static load charts came down the same week, the laminated reference sheets on the wall beside every assessment platform, the ones that listed median load capacity by species, weight class, and training tier, the ones Queleth had used as a baseline for 41 cycles without once finding reason to question them. He replaced them with a single line, printed without a frame. Strength is not the load, it is the reason you lift. He had not planned to put it on the wall. He had written it in a working document while drafting the new curriculum criteria, as a note to himself about the direction the criteria should take. Then he had looked at it for a while and ordered a plaque. The curriculum addendum followed the plaque by 72 hours. All candidates assessed in load scenarios must demonstrate capacity to be carried, willingness to carry others, and performance under conditions that replicate their training environment rather than the hall's standard baseline. No species was named in the addendum, none needed to be. The silhouette archive on the far wall, the record holders, backlit in pale green, 60 cycles of Drevani champions and Caerleon long-distance carriers, gained one new entry at its far end. No species designation, no record weight, just an Academy ID and below it, in the smallest font the archive system allowed. Human limits are situational. Graduation day came with rain. The specific cold rain of an institute that had been built for durability rather than comfort, the kind that found the gap between your collar and your neck and stayed there. The flags furled and the cadets stood in their rows, and the ceremony proceeded with the gravity that ceremonies always have when the people inside them are thinking about what comes next rather than the moment itself. Mara Soli stood in the second row. Queleth watched from the covered walkway beside the chamber entrance, as he always did at graduation, this particular spot, this particular angle, the one that let him see the hall entrance behind the cadets and the ceremony at the same time. She did not stand out. She did not shrink. The old undershirt was visible at her collar again, the faded green one from the first day. She had the canteen on her belt. When the cadets dispersed, most moved toward the transport platforms and the covered reception in the North Hall. She moved toward the chamber entrance, and Queleth understood, without having planned it, that he had been standing in this spot because some part of him had known she would come back here. She stopped in front of the plaque. Strength is not the load, it is the reason you lift. She read it with the same flat attention she had given the blocks, not performance, not emotion. Assessment, the careful, unhurried reading of a person determining whether a thing is true. She read it a second time. Queleth crossed the walkway and stood beside her. He was holding the curriculum addendum, folded, not in an envelope, not formally presented. Just paper, the way you carry something you want to give to someone when you find them. He handed it to her. She unfolded it. Read it once. Folded it smaller, a precise fold habit, and put it in her coat pocket without looking at him. "Took you long enough," she said. She was not unkind. There was no edge in it, no satisfaction. It was the voice of someone stating a plain fact about elapsed time between a question and its answer, the way you say a thing when the thing is simply true, and saying it doesn't require a particular feeling. She walked toward the transport dock through the rain. Queleth watched her go. The following morning, He returned to the hall before the first session. No candidate scheduled, no session to prepare. He ran the floor diagnostic anyway, each quadrant in sequence, and stood in the empty hall and looked at the archive wall and the new plaque and the cracked platform that had been repaired overnight with composite fill, the seams still visible as a pale diagonal line across the tile. The structural alarm was reset. The load distribution sensors were replaced. The drone that had crashed its logic stack had been serviced. It hovered at its standby position in the corner, operational. The new sensor array blinked once. It recalibrated a brief internal adjustment, the system checking its own baseline against the hall's current state. Then it saved a baseline file. Queleth could see the save confirmation on the monitoring screen at the secondary station. Baseline saved. Comparison point: none. Status: waiting. He stood there for a while. He had spent 41 cycles building a framework that told him what a candidate was before they stepped onto the platform. The framework had been useful. It had been accurate, within the range of what it was built to measure, for every candidate it had ever encountered until the one who asked whether he meant what she could lift or what he could record. He had not understood the question when she asked it. He understood it now. She had been asking whether the test was about her or about his instruments. And the answer, the real answer, the one he had not been able to give her at the time, was that he had designed the test to measure candidates, but what the test had actually been measuring for 41 cycles was his own assumptions about what a candidate could be. No, he revised that. He was performing certainty again. What the test had been measuring was the question he knew how to ask, and she had asked a different one. The canteen entry in the official assessment archive was flagged by the records administrator within a week. A polite note asking for clarification on whether it belonged in the load record field, which had a defined scope, or whether it should be moved to the candidate personal effects section, which was a form primarily used for items left behind after an incident. Queleth replied, "It stays where it is. It is the only piece of equipment in the room that did not break." The records administrator filed this under examiner's note, non-standard, and moved on. The entry remained. 3 months later, a methods review board convened to assess the new intake protocols. The board included 2 species Queleth had never assessed for load capacity, one from a world with gravity running well below the hall's standard baseline, one from a world that most species charts listed as mildly hostile. The mildly hostile world representative asked, during the review, why the new protocols had been implemented without a species-specific flag in the human assessment section. Queleth said, "Because the flag would have assumed we knew what to flag for." The board moved on to the next item. Outside the chamber, through the narrow window at the far end of sublevel 4, the rain had stopped. The early light came in at a low angle and crossed the floor in a long pale stripe, touching the edge of the repaired platform seam, the pale composite line that marked where the floor had met something harder than it had been designed for. The new sensor array blinked in the corner. The status screen read, comparison point, none, baseline saved, waiting. It would wait. It had been built to wait for a result that fit its categories, and it had found one that didn't, and it had saved the data anyway and was ready for the next one. That was all it could do, and it was enough. On the assessment console in the candidate record field, the entry Queleth had written was still open, not submitted to archive yet, still in the working file where he could read it. He read it once more. Human limits are not a ceiling. They are a question we have not learned to ask correctly. He submitted it. The console confirmed the submission and closed the file. The hall entered standby. The silhouette archive dimmed. The unlabeled new entry at the far end of the wall held its pale green glow in the residual light. Academy ID only, no number, no record weight, no species name. Just the note beneath it. Human limits are situational.